Welcome to ResoLex Talks. I'm delighted to have Jane Gunn with me here today. Now, like ourselves, Jane comes from the world of mediation and dispute resolution, and that has led to the development of the awareness of the role of conflict within collaboration and how to generate a positive outcome from that. So, Jane, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So, when talking about collaboration, the natural response that we get from most people is that conflict is just to be avoided at all costs.
Yes.
But you have a slightly different approach to this, and you recently came and spoke on the potential positive impact of conflict on collaboration. So do share some of your thoughts with us.
So I talk about conflict as the magic ingredient in businesses and in projects and generally in life actually. And the reason is that I think you can't avoid it, it's everywhere, it's a natural part of life. But the thing is, if you accept, acknowledge and actively manage it, then you can use the energy behind it and the positivity behind it to add value. That's the way I see it. And so I don't talk about conflict avoidance, but really conflict acceptance. It's going to happen. So I talk about it if you were to imagine your garden, for example. If you didn't, so conflict is like water. If you don't water your garden, what happens to your garden? Well, it shrivels up and dies. So there's nothing there, there's nothing growing, there's nothing new. If you overwater it, on the other hand, you're doing damage as well. So that's where you haven't accepted that it's going to rain and you haven't managed the resources. So generally, we have ways of managing water. We have water butts and reservoirs and all sorts of things to capture water. We know it's going to rain, we catch the water and we use it as we need it to add life to our gardens. So that's the way I think about it.
And I know you work with clients around managing that conflict and using it productively. You have a couple of models that you talk about in terms of the stages and the approach to managing it. Could you just talk us through those for a moment?
So the first model I use, which I think is absolutely critical, is the escalation of conflict model. It's not my model, it comes from a gentleman called Friedrich Blasel, who was an Austrian, I think, mediator. I think his book isn't in English, but his model is very useful. It's a 9-stage model. I talk about it in terms of it being like an escalator in a department store. That you've got when you can't stop yourself going to the bottom of the escalator once you're on it, and you need someone to press the red button at the bottom and stop and say, which stage have you got to, and let's rewind. So it starts at the top with any conflict with two people who for some reason have some kind of issue and they stop talking to each other. So face-to-face dialogue breaks down or becomes dysfunctional, if you imagine that. And then what happens, having turned their back on each other, they then gather support for their respective positions or points of view. So if you imagine in any office or even in your home life, you go and talk to someone else and get their support. It could be your best friend, it could be your partner. You guess what happened? You'll never guess what so-and-so did. And then you may get experts on your side as well. So sort of lawyers or a grievance process or whatever. But having gathered your team of supporters, you then move to the next stage, which is what are we going to do about that? Well, that could be firing off letters or sending emails or starting a process. So as you go down the ladder or the escalator, your ability to talk face-to-face to the other party and resolve the conflict fades away, and you become very much invested in what have you said to your group of supporters. And what's the next step? And the next step is always another step in escalation, which is then perhaps issuing a threat, taking some action. And the very last step, which I love, is called Into the Abyss Together, which basically means we've got to the stage where neither of us wants to lose face. We can't remember what the original issue was. We've long forgotten that. We only know that we don't want to lose face in front of our opponent and also now in front of our group of supporters, because they have invested in us and we've invested in them. And that's the stage that many conflicts get to. So it's a useful thing to remember. And often when I'm working with clients, I have to remind them this is almost an automatic process. Unless you've got someone to help you when you've got to a certain stage, you can't really de-escalate on your own. It's quite hard unless you know what you need to do to go back up the escalator again.
Do you find that you can train teams, train people into recognising those very early signs when potentially your foot's hovering over that top step on the escalator and you have a choice?
Yes.
You can still prevent yourself from disappearing down.
Yes, very much so. That's the thing. Whilst I'm a mediator and I help people who've reached the end stage of disputes, I've always been very interested in what we call early dispute resolution, helping people to recognise and be able to verbalise these feelings, these senses that something's not quite right. And very often the best teams are the worst at acknowledging conflict, because nobody wants to rock the boat and say, actually, we're not happy or things aren't quite right. And if you've got budgets and deadlines and so on, nobody wants to put their hand up and say, actually, there's something not quite right here, or these two people aren't getting on, or these two teams aren't getting on. But the ability to identify that and then acknowledge that and do something about it is really important.
And any particular helpful actions, helpful models for being able to deal with it?
One of the models I use is what I call the 4 C's of collaboration. And it's a model based on how our brain works, which is that we instinctively look for threats, even when we're in social situations. And what we need to do is to understand when that's happening. So very often in everyday conversations or everyday transactions with other people, we inadvertently upset them. And there are 4 C's in my model, called connection, consideration, control and caring. And they're all sort of on a spectrum. You know, every transaction you have and every conversation you have could be marked as being somewhere along there. You know, either it evoked a collaborative response, in other words, people felt very happy to carry on working together and very comfortable, or it evoked a sense of conflict, in which case people went, oh, I don't feel very comfortable about that. And at the worst end of that, people who feel in conflict will actively do something, possibly to sabotage or to undermine or gossip or start that conflict process.
Yeah.
So connection is the first C, and that's about a sense of, does the way you're interacting with other people or transacting with people make anybody feel less than you, less good about themselves, that you've got a better idea than them or their ideas don't count, that kind of thing. And is there any sense in which there is cliquiness going on? So there are senses in which some people feel in a group or out of a group. And that can happen really easily these days. I mean, you see email transactions where people are left off or blind copied, or all sorts of games go on with emails. And this kind of reaction can be really evoked very quickly in the way we have conversations around things that are quite important, but don't necessarily recognise the impact it's having on how another person feels, and are we making them feel less than good, or that their effort was less than good, without actually acknowledging or dealing with that. So the second C is consideration, and that is about really treating people with courtesy and respect. So it's very much, again, it's sometimes when a project or a team reaches a critical stage with something, sometimes people are less than courteous and less than respectful, and the language can be so, and again, just simple things can knock people off balance and make them feel unappreciated or not part of the team or not wanting to collaborate. The third C is control, and I think this is a very big topic because there's a sense in workplaces and in teams where, and in how our brain works, where all of us want to feel in control of and fully aware of what's going on and what's going to happen next, and that we ourselves are in control of what's happening to us. but also in an organisation, those that are managing us or a project want to be in control of what's happening. So the balance between who's in control and does somebody feel micromanaged and done to and over-controlled, or do they feel they've got enough information about what's happening next and how their relationship with their superiors are to feel comfortable. So that's a huge issue about how do you manage that issue of control and management and managing people and get that right so that people still feel willing to collaborate. Caring is the last one, and I say that we all have a sort of antennae on our head, which is, you know, even you and I now in conversation, which is monitoring every conversation from moment to moment, which says, do I matter and am I heard? And that's really critical because I think, you know, we all want to feel that we do matter and that we've been heard, and that if people feel they've been ignored, or if in a meeting they feel their voice hasn't been heard, or they don't know how to say something, you know, one of the questions people ask, how do I have a voice? How do I raise issues? I guess that brings me on to one of the important things, which is in any process or in any organisation, there ought to be a systematic approach to managing conflict. You know, you said how do we recognise it early? And the way is for organisations to actually create some kind of framework, some kind of process, some kind of system whereby everybody knows that it's okay to acknowledge that we have an issue, or what we call a conflict, whatever you like to call it, but what do we do about it? Who do we speak to? The idea is that at the earliest possible stage, face-to-face conversations between the people who are involved in this particular issue or conflict should happen without having to escalate to higher members of staff or members higher up the hierarchy, because that's what wastes time and money. But at what stage is that not working or not possible, or is that relationship broken down, it needs to be escalated? And the idea as much as possible is to avoid formal processes, whether those are grievance processes or litigation processes, but to manage the issues in a way that enables you to de-escalate and find a solution.
That's me, right. So there's an awful lot there to think about, and I'm sure if somebody watching won't be able to remember all of that.
Yeah.
So from there, I think it's rather delightful that we can say that Jane has agreed to join the associate panel, and that we're looking forward to being able to offer some of this insight out to clients, both, I believe, both in person, and you have a set of training videos as well to allow groups to build up their own skill set at doing this.
Yes, absolutely. I'm really excited about that, Ed, to be able to join your associate team. So I'm able to offer this training face to face. It's a sort of blended, what we call a blended learning approach. So it's supported by a series of videos whereby you can recap what you've learned and some of these key points if you're in a situation which is a challenging or a crisis or whatever. And I also have a small book which also supports the whole thing, a pocket book called The Authority Guide to Conflict Resolution, which completes the whole set of materials. Yes.
Well, it's wonderful to have you on board with this, and we're looking forward to the added value that will give to clients. So thank you very much for coming in today
Thank you
and
very
joining
much.
us for this talk.
Thank you.